witnessing or observing the scene since the Iraq war in 2003, and also those strikes against terrorism or against ISIL in Syria raise also the questions of legitimacy according to international law. What exact force does international law allow in that case, and what is the exact role of the coalition Arab members of the countries who are participating in that war, and where is that war that is waged by the coalition and the US and the Arab members in that coalition? Where is that taking the Obama as a US president in his final term? And lots of questions we're going to be raising it in this edition of Windows on Current Affairs, and we're very delighted to have with us Dr. Muhanna, the political analyst. Good evening, Dr. Mehna. First of all, let us talk about the question that raises itself strongly while the U.S. and takes the decision of waging war against terrorism under the pretext of striking Syria, ISIL inside Syria. The question, the important question that would raise itself here today is it's not how the U.S. and the coalition are going to raise that war or wage it, more than of a question of how is it going to end that war, especially after what we have seen in the former President Bush's term, in his final term, and how he ended his term as a U.S. president.
First of all, the Democrats are quite moderate in their waging of war, not like the Republicans, Bush, the father and the son. Bush, the father and son, would have really waged a war a few months ago. Still, the United States trying to protect its interests and the economic resources that exist in the Middle East, and they benefit quite a lot from that. They're relying on the resolution of the Security Council 2170 that basically permits the use of military forces against any terrorist attacks. But what I see, it's another problem that has been exported to the Arabs under the policy that was formed by Condoleezza Rice, that is structured from within. So in the last speech of President Obama, talking about how the U.S. is going to get involved in fighting terrorism, they basically confirmed that he's not going to create another fight on the ground level. He's going to use airstrikes systematically, and then empower the Arabs and their armies to participate in the war on the ground level. And I'd like to say that Tony Blinken, the vice advisor of the national security to the White House, said that America this time is going to play it more intelligently in terms of involving itself in wars against terrorism outside the borders of the United States, but will happen through the coalition. It's not going to happen through the Americans. Well, he also said that Daesh really is trying to instigate that. They send American troops on the ground to try to fight them and create that chaos in the Middle East. But Mr. Blinken said he's not going to support any ground movements from the American side, especially that it's basically as not a systematic war that you can really find out when it begins and when it ends. But what I see here, it's another plot that's being planted in the Middle East to try to break the Arab nationalism and have a major impact on the Arab national security. So what we need at this point is to think it through, and I think the decision that was made by the Egyptian administration that they will not going to get involved on the ground level. They will provide logistics and some support to the coalition. But I think the major threat here is on Emirates and Saudi Arabia.
Right. These strikes against ISIL by the U.S. and the coalition Western forces and the Arab countries, they don't get observed the same way by different people. I mean, different people see it in different ways. Like, for example, some see it as a dual repeated policy of the U.S. to strike at militants publicly, while from under the table they are providing them with arms, with strategy, with finance and all that, which is the main foundation for violence and terrorism. And then in public they would then attack them. And they would get other people involved, get their hands dirty with that. And they pretend that they're watching. This is a repeated scenario, and it didn't prove any success.
Foreign policy. It's a foreign policy for the Americans that never changes. They plot something and then they use it as a Trojan horse. and get through it into the Middle East. Now supporting they call it the Free Army of Syria, the ones against Bashar. At the same time, so we've got three groups in Syria at the moment: the state army, we've got the people that are against Bashar, and we've got ISIL in the same time. So they're saying they're going to offer one party weapons and logistics and fight the other one. And who can control, as you kindly mentioned now, it becomes a chaos on the ground. We've got three parties fighting each other. Nobody knows who's right.
Even more than three rival parties involved in that war.
And we've
if
got
you can continue and then I'll get on
the Shia and Sunna as well. So if you really look at ideologies, the same situation is in Iraq. Shia and Sunnis, and then we've got the Daesh as well. So it creates more chaos. And I think the targeting of airstrike is not accurate deliberately. And it basically breaks down the entire infrastructure of the country. And we've seen that in 1990 when the Americans left Iraq. We've got nothing, absolutely. We've got 5 million people drinking water from the sewage. So I think here the policy again is that United States is trying to follow a systematic airstrikes on certain targets, mainly are weapon areas that basically breaks down the entire country thereafter. And also, on the same time, they're supporting the Arab coalitions, trying to get them or drag them into the war, and it will never end. And the Arabs are the ones that are going to pay the price for that. And the third one is play the media war against Daesh, framing them as a terrorist group, which it is, and then in the end, supporting also refugees. And we've got now refugees moving from one country to another, so it's creating more chaos in the region. I think the problem here is that the Arabs need to think this through again, getting themselves involved. A war, all we're talking about here for Daesh, probably 30,000 soldiers. Does it require a coalition of 40 countries or 40 states going into the Middle East and stay another 10, 15 years, as happened in 1990? Arabs need to realize that they control 50% of the world resources, and that's why these countries are here. These countries are here for the oil and the rest of resources. And also United States, repeating, as you mentioned earlier, repeating the same policy. And now they have a strong hand in during the absence of Russia, because Russia is quite involved now with the war with Ukraine. China is not going to get involved in this chaos at this point. So America is having a free ride. And since the start of time, America always breaks the rule of the Security Council and attacks countries. Most of the time, like in 1990, there was no clear resolution that permits the use of forces against anybody. And we've seen a lot of people have died, really, because
that would
of the
bring
strikes.
another question that is not it's going to be our issue, but since you bring it on, the way the U.S. and the coalition is behaving right now, does it give Russia the right to attack Ukraine the same way, for example?
Absolutely.
If things work that way?
Exactly. It is agreements. We've seen that in the Cuban rockets that was set up to attack United States, and they had the agreement during the Cold War, and they had the agreement that Russia withdraws the rockets. At the same time, America will give something in return in Europe. And we've seen at some point of time Russia was having a free ride in Europe, and we've seen the natural gas was one of them, and that the United States was backing off. I think it's all in the end the business, and the Arabs are not reading that. Russia will get involved when they have interest, and that's why I like the area, the free zone area in Egypt, and the industrial zones that will be created by Russians. As soon as you bring these countries into the Middle East, they will have economic interest, plus China and India and Korea. These countries will have to get involved to protect their interests. So therefore, the Arabs are protected by enemies just for the sake of having business. So we do really have a problem, and my expectation is this is going to escalate, because Daesh is not that strong, but the existence of 40 countries on the Arab soil is going to create
and the penetration of Daesh inside the region.
Absolutely.
But also going back to the policy of the U.S. administration, it looks somehow unclear and not sustainable to others who are observing it, like I mentioned earlier before. As we can see that it wants to destroy ISIL, while it has continued to support its main root groups and founded its ideologies by their own hands, like the Brotherhood in the region, for example, and even the Syrian Jabhat al-Nusra before, during the Syrian revolution, the so-called Syrian revolution. Also, it's requesting a coalition with Qatar, and Qatar is the key ally of the most dangerous
because
jihadist
they have a
militants,
military base. So
and financing them and supporting them logistically, as you said, and ideologically and everything. So how could this happen? I mean, if they're going to support, for example, the rebels in Syria, it would take them, even talking about logistically, it would take them a long time to be able to be trained to eradicate the terrorism out of...
but that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Once and for all. So does that signify us or give us a signal of what the scenario that's going to take place is going to take for a long time? It's not going to be like
exactly
3 months or a
and we've
10
seen
months
now
war or something.
15 years down the line. Now, where are the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? None. So you destroyed an entire country, bringing people on their knees, drinking water from the sewage, and in the end we say, you know, sorry, we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. It's exactly the same thing. It's a plot planted into the Arab soil to break that national, or the nationalism, the Arab nationalism, for the benefit of Israel. United States never respected Security Council resolutions, and that's quite clear from the 1960s and 70s, even before that, with the establishment of the Israeli state. So I think here what they're trying to do is basically empower certain groups against each other, and in the end it will leave it with a civil war in every country, and every country is kind of closed on itself in a civil war and leaving Israel to have a free ride. The problem here is not the power or the intelligence of the Americans, it's the weakness of the Arabs. The weakness of the Arabs, that they're able to target some of them against the others. And now we've seen, as you kindly mentioned, the situation of Qatar.
And
so
also
Qatar,
the problem, excuse me if I intervene here, the problem of taking the bait every time.
Absolutely.
It is thrown to them.
I don't think it's just weakness, it's also people that sold the nation long time ago. The Western society.
But is it the case right now? I mean,
it is exactly the same situations. Let me just repeat what Churchill said. Churchill said that if all Germans die, we'll have no technology, and if the Arabs die, we'll have no betrayal. So the problem here, we betray each other. That is exactly the situation. So we have countries against each other and not supporting each other. We're talking about 500 million Arab in the Middle East. We're talking about 40% resources, but yet we cannot unite. We've got exactly the same culture, same language, same religion, and we've got the same land, and we can't even have unified rule of governance. We cannot have even a unified approach to development, to even economic cooperation. The problem is us, it's not the Americans. They have no power over the Arabs except what the Arabs give them.
Right, we're going to be touching on the Arabs' role later on, but let's talk about the Turkish role this time. As we all know that today the Turkish parliament has approved strikes or the participation of Turkey in that so-called coalition. And as we all know also that Turkey has for decades fought against the PKK, and the struggle have caused tens of thousands of deaths in Turkey. And ISIL also is fighting against the Kurd paramilitaries from the PKK and the YPK, as we all know. Now, Turkey is in fact supportive of ISIL and similar members of that militants in Iraq and in Syria. So where does that leave Turkey as a member in the coalition? Whom is Turkey going to fight? Are they going to fight in favor of the coalition and the U.S. and against terrorism, or are they going to fight the other way around? How? I mean, people who are observing the situation are in jeopardy. They don't understand what's going on.
If you look at the southern border of Turkey, they've got a problem with the Kurdish, they've got a problem with Iraqis, they've got a problem with Syrians. But at the same time, Daesh is attacking their enemies. Hypothetically to say, Daesh is attacking Iraq and will try and take control of Iraq and take control of Syria. So that stands in the benefit of Turkey. So what Turkey is doing at the moment is waiting until Daesh takes over the two countries and then will join the coalition to be against Daesh. So this way, the southern border of Turkey will be absolutely secure between Iraq and Syria. In the media, the Turkish government also announced that they are going to support the coalition, and United States also announced that the NATO will stand behind Turkey in the fight against Daesh. So as you kindly mentioned, nobody understands what's going on.
But in the meanwhile, what is Turkey's role? until Daesh
Turkey is
takes
providing
over?
at the moment just logistics.
Are they going to protect Daesh? Are they going to be against Daesh? Or?
They're going to wait for them to take over, but they're not going to get involved straight away because they don't want Daesh. But Daesh is helping them. It's the enemy of the enemy. So Daesh is helping them to break down Iraq and Syria completely. And I think my expectation, they're going to use Daesh to break down al-Assad. And thereafter, they're going to attack them. So they use certain
Then they're
groups
not
for a
joining
reason.
the U.S. and the coalition.
At the moment, it's just a decision to join, and they will definitely join. And it's exactly the same thing if you look at the 90s and the support of the Americans to the Afghani fighters against Russia. When these fighters are exactly the Qaeda. They are exactly the same people, the terrorists that are called terrorists now. So
it's
they
the same
use them.
grassroots.
Absolutely. So it's exactly the same policy. I support someone because he attacks my enemy, so I support him. Once he finishes off my enemy, and then I get rid of him. So it's just a tool to break down what they want to do. And as I said earlier, it's just a Trojan horse. It's a tool, it's a hand that they can break down the entire Middle East and make sure that the Arab nationalism never achieves its objectives. And here, Arabs are not buying or not trying to understand, and every time they take the bait.
If we look at Syria at the same time, whom the U.S. Is very busy in their minds with this particular part of the Arab world, Syria now, and they are planning to strike and invade. The opposition in Syria, for example, they vary in kind and camps, and were given the name moderate by the U.S. administration, and a great wise deal of that opposition are against the bombing in all ways. The U.S. now, they are bombing, and they have already bombed Syria, and they want that to happen in support of this opposition in Syria, who are already in protest against the bombing. So that would leave the moderate, the so-called moderate opposition by the U.S. Under the command of ISIL in reaction to that bombing, or what?
That's right.
So how are they going to be in support of the coalition
I
and at the same time
what they're trying to do is bring down Bashar al-Assad. That's what they're trying to do. Bashar al-Assad's got two groups against him at the moment, ISIL and the opposition. They announced definitely they will support the opposition with weapons, logistics, aid and everything. So now we've got, you know, hypothetically, as they said, it's a group, strong fighters of Daesh plus the opposition. It's going to create a chaos in Syria, and my expectation that Bashar will not be able to sustain it. At the same time, they cannot attack the Bashar directly because Russia and China are standing. So they're creating another reason to attack Syria, which is Daesh or the ISIL. So I think the eyes of the Americans is to end the rule of Bashar al-Assad, but they cannot attack him directly because of the support of the Russians and the Chinese governments in terms of the voting on the veto. So I think they're creating a Daesh or helping Daesh to get into Syria to become the bait or the reason for them to attack them so they don't move down into Israel. So in the end, my expectation, this is going to end the rule of Bashar al-Assad quite soon, and on the same time, they're going to take over the entire Iraq, and they're going to be a major threat in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia will be dragged into a fight with ISIL.
Which part are they going to join hands? I'm talking about the opposition. Daesh now against Assad, or the U.S. and the coalition against Daesh?
They're supporting both. Remember,
when it comes to the bombing,
not formal. The support is not formal. It's all under the table, black operations used by the CIA. So what they're having at the moment is black operations supporting Daesh to get stronger, because logically, where did they get the weapons? A group of fighters that became a major power in few months. So they get logistics somewhere, they get aid somewhere, they get weapons somewhere. So my analysis to this is they're supporting Daesh under the table, but formally they're supporting the opposition, both going to be fighting Bashar al-Assad to bring him down. In the end, the opposition versus ISIL, who's going to take the rule?
Also, another important question that raises itself, if you would be asked to classify this Free Syrian Army or the Syrian opposition, that would be also important to classify them. Great deal of them are Jabhat al-Nusra. How would you classify
the opposition is quite clearly terrorist because they are a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So at the moment, this is why.
So how would
not
they
gonna
be
get
able
into solution.
to be able to be against their affiliated militants, the Daesh?
Because of the ideology is different.
I'm sorry I'm asking you that questions,
absolutely, absolutely.
it's the questions that lay in the mind of every Egyptian or everyone who's watching this
if you look
situation
at the
right
supports,
now.
Logically, the Salafis in Egypt should support the Muslim Brotherhood, but they will not, because the ideology is different. Because this is a major deviation of religion. It's an introduction of a religion that's been totally off track. People misrepresented Islam. Islam never supports a bloodshed. And if you look at both, they shed blood. You're looking at people slaughtered by the opposition, and it's on TV, on the news, so they
The same Daesh side.
Absolutely. So it's exactly the same actions, but the ideology is different. And therefore, in the end, with the fall of Bashar al-Assad, both going to fight for the country, who rules, and in the end it becomes a civil war again. So instead of 3 parties, become 2, and the civilians on the ground level absolutely bombed by both of them, and the same situation in Iraq. You've got Sunnis, Shias, and you've got the Sunnis and Shias against ISIL, and they've got the 3 of them against the Kurdish, and that's how it creates a chaos from in the Middle East. And it's absolute implementation of the strategy that was put by Condoleezza Rice, the destruction from within.
And where do you see the Russian role here?
Russians will get involved as soon as it really affects their interests economically. At the moment, they're still benefiting, trying to support the Arabs against Europeans, because Europeans are all against Russia now because of the problem of Ukraine. But as soon as Russia really gets its hand free of that problem, I don't think they will support the Arabs. And we've seen that in 1973 when they were delaying the armed deals that was basically signed with Sadat. So they were not really worried about Egypt falling in the war against Israel. They get involved in the last minute when they know that their interests will be affected. And in the end, it's all business. It's agreements under the table between the Russians and American. Arabs play the price, and on the table, it's all under the sake or under the umbrella of human rights and the spread of democracy.
And fighting terrorism, yes. I guess the commission is, I mean, in relation to what you have earlier mentioned about the Arabs and their role and how they share in creating or evoking such a situation here in the region. Earlier, the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi declared that they will not accept any foreign troops on the ground, and he said he would rather accept UK training, intelligence and technology other than ground troops. And he warned that international and regional polarization had created, in fact, to the rise of ISIL, and announced the creation of a caliphate inside large swaths of Iraq and Syria under its control. And he asserted on or affirmed the importance of maintaining the relations and tight ties now with neighboring countries.
Absolutely.
Maybe he was hinting at what you have earlier said in
Absolutely.
our
Absolutely. It's
in our
basically a
episode.
threat that was thrown to the Arabs. The problem here is that the ties among the Arabs can actually drag them, all of them, into the war, and it's never going to end. And I think the situation that was taken by the Egyptian administration not to get involved on the ground level, I think they quite clearly understand what is going on the ground level. And probably in a former episode, I said that the Americans never supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. What they wanted is drag the Egyptian army into fight with the Brotherhood.
The same thing like it's happening in Syria or Iraq.
Absolutely. So they're not supporting the opposition of Syria. They never do. But they were actually doing, under the umbrella of human rights and democracy, giving them weapons. But what they actually want is exhaust the army of Bashar. And that's exactly the same thing they wanted to do in Egypt, is exhaust the Egyptian army by getting them into a fight, or street fights if you like, with the Muslim Brotherhood. And exactly the same thing is happening now, getting armies of the state to get involved in fighting Daesh, and it becomes absolutely, it's a street war. It's not an organized war where you know where it ends, where it begins, and how you strike and how you move on the ground level. And you also don't have that intelligence in terms of information to know where these people are, who's supporting them. So you're actually getting into a war that you never know where it begins and where it ends.
But wait a minute, in terms of I mean human rights, international human rights issues, speaking of that street wars that you don't know where it ends and where it begins and where it ends, isn't that, how dangerous is it, in other words? How would that be dangerous on the civilians, and how would that be dangerous on the state itself and the state security?
It creates a lot of problems, but mainly two things that we worry about in a street war. Number one, it breaks down the entire administration of the country, because you would have parties involved on a government level, on a ground level, and you never know really who's pushing it. So number one, it creates that chaos on a system level, so the entire administration of the country becomes in a chaos. Number two, it drags the civilians into wars by destroying their homes, creating a lot of refugees that move around, and the problem with that, they become part of the civilians. You actually never know who's actually the soldier and who's the civilian, and that's exactly the same thing that we experienced in Sinai. And it took the army quite a long time to try to separate them. That's the problem with having the civilians involved. Again, it's just a chaos. Once the government or the state loses control over the street, that's where they become parties, and exactly the same thing that you would see in Rwanda and Burundi. The state is gone in terms of administration.
And Libya also the same.
Absolutely. So what happens here, you take the law into your own hands, because you never know who's with you and who's against you, and it becomes groups. And here is the major danger with dividing the country. That's exactly the ultimate goal they want.
And where does that leave the U.S. administration and its coalition allies fighting terrorism? Is that eradicating terrorism, or in other words, is it creating terrorism?
Absolutely. They create terrorism. Americans create terrorism, because who created Al-Qaeda? They created Al-Qaeda in the 80s and 90s when they were fighting Russia. So they created them.
If this is their principle, then who is buying that from them? Why are the coalition?
And
why?
we still believe them. That's the problem. I think in running a proper state, we need three angles that need to be properly done. Number one is the people that run the state, the political system. Number two is the objectives, why we live as Egyptians. What do we want to do? What do we want to be? And then number three is the activities or the tasks that every one of us is required to do. In the end, will create a proper state. We've got a problem always with these three angles. We always have a problem with the people. Nepotism, ignorance, illiteracy. We've got, in Egypt, for example, we've got 42% are actually illiterate. We've got 63% below the breadline. And that is the problem. These people are easy to target, get them into terrorism, and I always say that the problem with fighting terrorism, even here in Egypt, we only achieved about 50%, because there's another 50 that lies with the citizen. We've got a lot of people that misunderstood religion. There are a lot of people that are still dragged by the Muslim Brotherhood. What we need now is the role of the Azhar, Kanisa, and the Ministry of Culture, that these people need to be trained. They need explanation.
And economic reformation as well.
Exactly
other
the same
elements
thing you
involved.
will see in all our countries.
Right, but that would also, if we take it from here, that would raise another question, which is, if that is the case, then doesn't that teach us a lesson from what we see happening now, the situation in Iraq and in Syria, the people who were criticizing the violation of human rights here, and the way the Brotherhood were removed by the people, the Egyptian people, and mandated by the army from power, the so-called legitimate power. Does what's happening in Syria and Iraq explain to those people the importance of what the Egyptian people and its army have done to the Egyptian state?
But
what does that teach them?
It doesn't teach them anything, because the Arabs have always been known that they don't read. If they read, they forget. And once they forget, they don't learn. So it's just a cycle. We just read. We all know the Americans since the beginning of time. We should remember they refused to support us in the high dam. They played a major role with Israel against Egypt in 1967 and 73, and we still have a relationship, and we open up the door. And since 1980 to 2011, we've been giving our heads to the Americans, controlling us. And sorry to get out of the topic here, but I want to remind the Egyptians that you collected $9 billion in a week, which is equal to 9 years of U.S. aid in 9 years.
That's very important, by the way.
Absolutely.
But I was talking about the camp who was always criticizing what happened in June 30th.
Yeah.
I mean, removing or sacking or ousting the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And robbing them of their legitimacy, in their own words. What does what's happening in Syria and Iraq teach those people or explain to those people?
It's a strong lesson. You should learn, and you shouldn't take the bait. But the problem again, Ms. Dina, is that people don't learn. That is the problem. We keep taking the bait. I mean, this bait is 14 years after the Gulf War, and it's exactly the same bait. Absolutely. Number one was, in 1990, the weapons of mass destruction. Saddam supports the terrorist groups. Exactly the same thing. We've been dragged 14 years down the line, and the major destruction of Iraq, major destruction of Syria, and then with the rise of the Arab Spring and major destruction and chaos in the entire Middle East. I think the Arabs need to wake up. And they were, if you probably would look at that, as some of the recommendations that we need to look at is something that we probably can touch on in terms of the creating that Arab integration economically, politically, and legitimately.
Right. If we're talking about airstrikes, possible airstrikes that are expected also in Iraq, and Turkey is joining this race also, we talk about also, if you observe the situation, the immense instability inside the Arab region, the polarization, the sectarian conflicts, the corrupted regimes for years, dictatorships in Iraq and Syria, and in all the Arab region, not only in Iraq and Syria. They were the main reason for the rich, fertile ground that is a safe haven now for these very dangerous militant jihadists. So in that case, would it be better to wage war against those jihadist militants, or maintain political reformation that is highly recommended than a military one to radically or to eradicate radically the uproots of...
You're absolutely right. We need to go in the two
which
directions
is much
parallelly.
better.
We need to go parallel.
Both of them.
Yeah, exactly. As the example I mentioned earlier, is that fighting terrorism takes two ways. 50% fighting the violent groups with the army. We succeeded in that. But we still have a part on the ground, people that people don't understand, and they will be dragged easily into violence. So we need to move on the two levels, on the political reform and development of the social and cultural aspects and understanding of the people of what the religion is and what terrorism is all about and who's your friend and who's your enemy. So that's on the citizens level. At the same time, we need to start waging a war, but with calculations. We need to start calculating how it's going to end, how it's going to how it's going to begin and how it's going to end, and who's our allies. Because in the end, we don't want to see the Arab region again 20 years down the line and we discovered that it was absolutely a fake movie, that in the end we paid billions of dollars and we're destroying our own infrastructure. We lost a lot of youth, and we lost grounds, and we lost our pride as Arabs, invaded always by groups and get blown up as, you know, the major thing, and they actually not that strong. I don't think Daesh is not I don't think Daesh is a strong group. It's just blown up on the media side by the Americans to shred the Arabs, and also fear them that they always gonna say, well, we accept what the Americans decide to do, and we just always get dragged by the Americans in the region on our own land and with our own money, because we pay for these weapons.
Right. Like you said, this is a very ugly scenario that some deal of Arab countries have been dragged to, except Egypt.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks to God and thanks to a very wise leader.
Absolutely.
That have supported us through our long way
fight,
towards
yes,
democracy.
with the brotherhood.
Now, speaking about the U.S. administration, the U.S. is, from where we observe what's happening, and for a decade now have led war on terror since 11 that have weakened American stance and strategic position and exhausted its financial resources and delegitimized it of its purpose inside the Middle East. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 and also the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and its allies, the policy of supporting the Palestinian Army in the Jabhat al-Nusra, and you can name that, and also supporting the Brotherhood organization everywhere, especially in Egypt. The failed...
It's just the Egyptian army and break it down as well.
Where does this mission leaves the U.S. administration, and in particular President Obama?
Well, the Americans are not happy with his performance, first of all. They're not happy
if it ends.
Well, it's not going to end because it's always going to get renewed by under a different name. It's a different name, but it's exactly the same scenario.
But how dangerous is it on Obama himself and his administration?
Absolutely. In terms of Obama administration, they already lost the faith in him. That's why, if you look at the statistics that I was just looking at, that the Republicans, 76% of the Republicans refused the airstrike on Syria. 60% of the Democrats refused, which basically means that 60% of his own party are not happy with him. So it's quite clear. So he lost the plot. Americans are regretting that they really nominated him for the second time. But the problem here again, going back to your first question, is where does this leave the American administration? It basically it leaves them with a bad reputation as people that always run after the money and resources. And we need to always remind the Arabs that you've got 40% of the world resources in here, and it's going to always be an area where they want to get in. And in terms of the Americans, they already have problems with the military manufacturing companies that they want to sell weapons. They've got a problem with energy. So they need oil, they need gas. They have already a high deficit in their budget. So how do we fix that as Americans? Get into areas of energy, the Arabs, and then have deals. We will fight terrorism for you, and for that, we will take the oil. And it's exactly the same thing they've been doing in Iraq. It's happening in Libya. So all they want is energy. In terms of pleasing the military manufacturing companies by selling weapons to the Arabs, using these weapons, and the Arabs are basically paying for them. The problem here comes back to us. And I'll tell you why economically. The world reserve in foreign currency is 70% in dollars, 20% in euros, and 10% in gold. Two countries can break the United States in 24 hours, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, because all their reserves combined are in dollars, and they can break the entire economy of the United States in 24 hours if they just do one small thing, change their reserve from dollars to euro, or from dollars to gold. So Americans have really become proud of themselves with the financial resources that the Arabs have given them. They don't take the money back. They sell the oil to the Americans, and at the same time the money stays in the United States in the American banks. So they got a lot of liquidity that they can pay around. So we empowered the Americans to attack us. They attacking us with our own money. They attacking us with our own soldiers, and they attacking us with the support of our own leaders themselves. And the problem here comes back to the leaders. Leaders neglected education. That's why we've got a range of 50% of the Arabs are illiterate. In the 21st century, half of our population is illiterate. And I just ask a question, what did King Fahd do in his rule? What did Mubarak do in 30 years? Leaving half the Egyptians illiterate. You've got 60% of the Egyptians are poor. So it comes back to the problem here that these people take the bait because they don't have the proper qualification to lead nations and understand what debate is all about. That's the problem.
And I can add to what you're saying is that the current U.S. strategy and policy negates the importance of cultural and social and development in our country. And they refer to the causes for terrorism in the shape of Jabhat al-Nusra and the Daesh and all those affiliated militant groups, while they are created and supported by them.
Absolutely.
when will the U.S. decision, in your own opinion, makers admit that ISIL and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra Front and similar groups are not just a terrorist group, but also an ideology coming from one source, which is the Wahhabi Salafist doctrine, which was created also by the unemployment and the poverty and illiteracy and everything, and so they are not saying that openly, but they know it very well, and they are supporting it and feeding it.
Absolutely. That's why
and they're forming a big coalition now, and they are asking Turkey to join in, and they've already, made some Arab countries to join in that coalition, while Daesh is not in need for all that.
Absolutely.
Hefty, bulky size of coalition.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it's an ideology, and an ideology, you cannot fight it by airstrikes.
Absolutely.
And you cannot fight it by coalitions.
Yeah.
You only fight it with
it's not going to end.
With
it's the culture.
Eradication of illiteracy. You fight it with political reformation. You fight it with social justice, employment. You fight it with economic reformation.
Yeah. That's why exactly.
When will the U.S. realize that,
announcement,
or admit it rather?
They look at 3 years to end up Daesh, but on the ground level, we're still going to pay the price for hundreds of years, because the ideology is on our land, and the people that are feeding it in the end is our own people. So the problem here again is not going to end, and if it ends for them, it's ending the military side. Right. But on the ground level, it's not going to end. And we can take it as an example. 1990, 91, 92, 93, the war is fading. So on the military side, Americans have finished their duty. Afghanistan is exactly the same. Now let's look at Arabs. Where is Iraq now? Gone. Where is Afghanistan? It's finished. Where is Libya? So this is exactly what's going to happen, because the war is on our own land. That's the problem. So we're going to continue paying the price forever, and Americans will never admit it that they are doing that. And I thank you for the expression that the Americans are using them, and that's exactly the case. They don't support them. They know it's dangerous ideologies on the modern civil society. They know that. But they're using them as a tool to attack their enemies. So exactly what they were doing with the Muslim Brotherhood. They wanted them to exhaust the Egyptian army, but in the end, they sold them.
And we were trying to explain to them that the dangers of the Brotherhood was in the fact that it's a dangerous ideology.
Absolutely.
And they were in protect of
and even President Sisi said that in his warnings to the Muslim Brotherhood, don't get dragged into the Khalifa kind of setup, because it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. The Americans are supporting them basically to create an ideology that the Muslims will like, in terms of unity among all the Muslims and the Arabs, become a strong nation. But that's a dream that's never going to come true until the citizens on the ground level are able to understand how the world ideologies move around them, and have that capability and qualification, knowledge and expertise to basically be strong and make a decision that is totally independent. And it's a great example that the Egyptians have collected $9 billion in a week, and it's an example and an indication that we don't need anybody. Why would you go and beg the United States for $1 billion a year, and they have a full control over your own decisions? I think now we start to take independent decisions, and the Arab needs to follow.
Finally, I have one quick question, because we only have 2 minutes left, or less than 2 minutes left. We need to know the role of Iran, as some Western political analysts observe that Iran and its Shia world is the only exit, or the only organized and unified, highly motivated power that can serve as an important player against the Daesh danger inside the region. So how do you observe that? How do you observe the Iranian role?
Iran is already under the heat because of the nuclear program. Now, if Iran supports the United States or the coalition against ISIL or Daesh, they basically shooting themselves in the foot, because they're already in the region. The 40 countries are already in the region. We need to remember that. But these countries are already in the Arab region, quite few kilometers away from Iran. So once they finish with ISIL or Daesh, they're not going to go away. They're going to stay for a couple of years at least, because they're saying in their announcements it takes them 3 years, which basically means they are on the footstep of Iran. So if Iran doesn't listen in terms of the conditions of the nuclear program, they're going to attack them. So Iran knows that the existence of the military coalition of the 40 countries, existence in on the Gulf, on the Arab Gulf, they are second. And therefore, they're going to keep feeding into the fire between Daesh, the Arabs, and the Americans to create that chaos, because it takes the attention away from them.
From that other